In the years before the Pacific War exploded into full-scale destruction, many Japanese generals believed they understood the United States.
Focus here. Our next move hinges on this sector.
American military doctrine from afar. Yet, behind closed doors, a dangerous assumption took root. An assumption that would later haunt their diaries, interrogations, and final reflections. To many senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, American firepower looked impressive on paper, but weak in spirit. They believed the United States relied too heavily on machines, factories, and mass production, while lacking the warrior discipline that Japan had cultivated for centuries. One Japanese general famously remarked before the war, "The Americans will fight loudly, but not for long." It was a fatal miscalculation. Japanese military culture valued endurance, sacrifice, and the willingness to die for the emperor. In contrast, American soldiers were often portrayed as comfort-loving, individualistic, and dependent on overwhelming material support. Japanese planners believed that if they struck fast and hard, crippling American forces early, the enemy's will to fight would collapse before its industrial strength could fully awaken. Pearl Harbor was designed around this belief. After the attack, early victories across the Pacific seemed to confirm Japanese confidence. Hong Kong fell. Singapore collapsed. The Philippines were overwhelmed. In after-action reports, Japanese officers wrote with pride about how quickly American defenses crumbled. One staff officer noted that American artillery response was disorganized and hesitant. Another claimed that American troops withdrew under pressure rather than counterattacking. But beneath these early successes, something far more dangerous was quietly building. Japanese generals underestimated not just American industry, but how Americans fought once fully mobilized. They mistook restraint for weakness. Before the war, American firepower had often been limited by budgets, politics, and peacetime doctrine. Once war came, those restraints vanished. Factories that once produced cars and refrigerators began producing tanks, bombers, and artillery shells in numbers no Japanese planner truly comprehended. What Japanese intelligence saw as theoretical capacity rapidly became operational reality. More importantly, Japanese officers misunderstood American doctrine. American commanders believed in preserving soldiers' lives through fire superiority. Rather than charging headlong into enemy positions, Americans would pulverize them first, with artillery, naval guns, and air power, then advance behind a curtain of steel. To Japanese generals, raised on the belief that spirit could overcome firepower, this approach felt almost dishonorable. One officer dismissed it as cowardly, writing, "They fight with machines, not hearts." What he did not yet understand was that this philosophy would allow American forces to fight longer, harder, and with devastating efficiency. Early encounters hid the truth. In jungle skirmishes and island landings, American firepower was sometimes constrained by terrain and inexperience. Japanese commanders interpreted this as proof that American weapons were overrated. Reports described American machine guns as wasteful and artillery barrages as excessive but inaccurate. But those reports were written before Guadalcanal, before Tarawa, before the full weight of American firepower was unleashed without hesitation. As the war continued, Japanese generals would slowly realize that they had not faced America's true strength yet. They had only seen the opening act. The storm was coming, and when it arrived, it would rewrite everything they thought they knew about modern warfare. By the time many Japanese commanders fully understood what American firepower truly meant, it was already too late. For Japanese generals, Guadalcanal was supposed to be a temporary setback, a minor operation to push the Americans back into the sea. Instead, it became the moment when confidence began to crack and doubt quietly entered the highest levels of command. At first, Japanese officers believed the American landing in August 1942 was reckless. Intelligence reports suggested poorly coordinated troops and limited supplies. One Japanese colonel wrote confidently, "They have come too far, too fast. Hunger and fear will defeat them before we do." But within weeks, something unexpected began to happen. American artillery started speaking with a voice the Japanese had never truly heard before. Unlike earlier engagements, the Americans on Guadalcanal did not rely solely on infantry attacks. They dug in, established artillery positions, and coordinated naval and air support with growing precision. Japanese assaults, brilliant in courage but predictable in execution, ran headfirst into walls of explosive fire. Japanese generals were stunned by the sheer volume of American shells. Night after night, jungle positions erupted in blinding flashes. Veterans later recalled that the ground itself seemed alive, shaking beneath their feet. One surviving officer would later admit during interrogation, "We believed bombardment prepared the way for attack. We did not expect it to become the DAC." The Americans did not merely soften Japanese defenses, they erased them. Even more unsettling was American naval firepower. When Japanese forces attempted to move reinforcements by sea, American warships turned coastlines into death zones. Battleships and cruisers fired shells larger than anything Japanese infantry had ever faced. Jungle cover, once a Japanese advantage, became meaningless under naval bombardment. A senior Japanese general wrote in frustration that American shells fell like metal rain, cutting trees, men, and weapons into the same shattered pieces. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was an honest admission of shock. Yet firepower alone was not what disturbed Japanese commanders the most. It was how Americans learned. Each failed Japanese attack was met with stronger American defenses. Machine gun positions multiplied. Artillery fire became faster and more accurate. Air support arrived with ruthless timing. Japanese generals realized that the Americans were not only powerful, they were adaptable. This clashed deeply with Japanese expectations. Pre-war doctrine assumed that American units would collapse under pressure. Instead, American troops endured attacks, absorbed casualties, and responded with overwhelming retaliation. One Japanese diary entry described an American counter-barrage that lasted hours, concluding bitterly, "Their response is not emotional. It is mechanical, endless." By late 1942, reports sent to Tokyo began to change in tone. Where earlier messages spoke of temporary resistance, now they warned of unprecedented material superiority. Some generals quietly admitted that Japan could not match this level of sustained firepower in a long war. Still, many clung to hope. They believed Guadalcanal was an exception, a uniquely difficult battlefield. They convinced themselves that future islands, better prepared and more fortified, would neutralize American guns. They were wrong. Guadalcanal was not an anomaly. It was a warning. For the first time, Japanese generals understood that American firepower was not just strong, it was systematic. It was designed to grind the enemy down, day after day, until resistance simply ceased to exist. But this realization came too slowly. By the time Japanese commanders fully accepted the truth, the Americans were already planning their next landings, and they were bringing even more guns. PSP. PSP. By 1943, Japanese generals no longer spoke with confidence when discussing American firepower. The illusion of temporary imbalance had been shattered. What they faced now was a relentless, expanding system of destruction. And Bougainville, Japanese commanders witnessed something unprecedented. Before American soldiers even stepped onto the beaches, the islands themselves were methodically dismantled. Hours, sometimes days of naval and aerial bombardment reduced carefully prepared defenses into smoking craters. One Japanese general, observing the bombardment of Tarawa, wrote later, "We believed nothing could survive such fire. Yet the Americans advanced as if destruction were routine." His words revealed both awe and despair. American firepower was no longer just about volume. It was about coordination. Naval guns struck known strongpoints. Aircraft attacked supply routes and command centers. Artillery followed precise schedules. When Japanese defenders attempted to move or counterattack, they were immediately detected and annihilated. To Japanese generals, it felt as though the Americans could see everything. This perception deeply unsettled Japanese command. Traditional tactics relied on concealment, night movement, and surprise. But American firepower denied all three. Radar-guided ships, forward observers, and constant air patrols made even the jungle unsafe. A captured Japanese officer later confessed, "There was no moment without fear. Even silence felt temporary." Perhaps the most painful realization for Japanese generals was that bravery no longer mattered in the way it once had. Entire units fought to the last man, yet achieved nothing. Waves of infantry attacks, once capable of overwhelming weaker foes, now dissolved under machine gun fire and artillery barrages before reaching American lines. One senior general wrote bitterly, "Our soldiers died beautifully, but beauty does not stop shells." American forces also displayed a disturbing patience. They did not rush. If resistance was strong, they paused and increased firepower. If a hill refused to fall, it was bombarded until it ceased to exist as a position. Time, for the Americans, was a weapon. Japanese generals began to understand that American doctrine treated firepower as a substitute for sacrifice. Where Japan spent lives, America spent shells. This imbalance haunted planning meetings. Japanese industry could not replace artillery, aircraft, or ammunition at the pace required. Every American barrage represented resources Japan could never match. Reports warned that defending islands would become impossible once American forces reached full operational strength. Some generals proposed radical solutions, decisive final battles, massed suicide attacks, or attempting to lure Americans into costly engagements. But even these ideas were quietly doubted. Firepower erased formations before they could maneuver. One late-war diary entry captured the despair. "We no longer fight the enemy. We fight the sky and the sea." By the end of 1943, Japanese generals no longer questioned whether American firepower was superior. They questioned whether any force could survive against it. Yet even now, many believed there might still be a way to break American resolve. One final shock that could force negotiation. They did not yet realize that American firepower was not meant to frighten. It was meant to finish the war, regardless of cost. And the worst was still to come. By 1945, Japanese generals no longer spoke of victory. Their language had changed, from strategy to survival, from not expect to defeat American forces. Their goal was simply to endure long enough to make the enemy pay a terrible price. Even that hope would be crushed by American firepower. Before the landings, Japanese commanders studied American preparations with grim clarity. Reconnaissance reports described endless fleets, aircraft carriers stretching to the horizon, and transport ships arriving in numbers that defied belief. One general reportedly asked, "Where does such abundance come from?" No one had an answer. When the bombardment began, it surpassed everything Japanese forces had previously experienced. Iwo Jima, American naval guns fired for days. The island, barely 8 square miles, was pounded with thousands of tons of explosives. Underground bunkers shook violently. Air was filled with dust, heat, and suffocating smoke. Japanese officers wrote later that it felt like being buried alive again and again. Yet the Americans kept firing. A Japanese general responsible for island defenses admitted afterward, "Our positions were intact only because we hid beneath the earth. Above ground, nothing remained." Even underground, survival was temporary. American forces adapted quickly, using flamethrowers, demolition charges, and precision artillery to destroy what bombardment could not. What terrified Japanese commanders most was not destruction, but persistence. American firepower did not pause, it did not weaken. If resistance continued, the response intensified. Each day brought more shells, more bombs, more men. Japanese generals realized there was no breaking point, no moment when the Americans would stop. Okinawa confirmed this horrifying truth. There, Japanese commanders watched entire defensive lines erased in hours. Artillery fire was so continuous that officers could no longer issue orders. Communication lines vanished. Units fought in isolation, unaware that neighboring positions had already been annihilated. One general later confessed, "Command became meaningless. Fire decided everything." For the first time, Japanese generals openly questioned their own doctrine. The belief that spirit could overcome material power lay in ruins. Soldiers fought bravely, even fanatically, but bravery could not stop bombs that fell from unseen aircraft or shells fired from ships beyond the horizon. Privately, some generals acknowledged that Japan had lost the war not on the battlefield, but in factories and shipyards years earlier. American firepower was the physical expression of an industrial force Japan could never rival. And still, the Americans advanced. Perhaps the most haunting realization came when Japanese generals observed American casualties. Despite the ferocity of combat, American losses, though significant, were sustainable. Wounded soldiers were evacuated, replaced, reinforced. The machine continued to function flawlessly. A senior officer wrote near the end of the Okinawa campaign, "They can endure loss because their strength is endless. Ours is already exhausted. By the summer of 1945, Japanese generals no longer debated tactics. They debated how long Japan itself could survive. They understood now, fully and painfully, what American firepower meant. But one final realization remained, one that would come only after everything had already been destroyed. After the war ended, Japanese generals spoke differently. There were no speeches of honor, no promises of final victory, no illusions left to protect. What remained were reflections, quiet, precise, and painfully honest. In interrogations, memoirs, and private diaries, a clear pattern emerged. Japanese generals did not describe American firepower as merely powerful. They described it as decisive, systematic, and unstoppable once unleashed. One former general summarized the war in a single sentence: "We lost the moment America chose to fight without limits." For years, Japanese military doctrine had believed that wars were decided by morale and spirit. American firepower shattered that belief. It proved that modern war belonged to those who could combine industry, technology, and discipline into a single, relentless force. Japanese officers were particularly struck by how impersonally Americans fought. Bombardments were not emotional responses. They were procedures. If resistance existed, it was removed. If defenses remained, they were destroyed. There was no rage, no hesitation, no exhaustion. One post-war testimony described American artillery as a language spoken without hatred. Perhaps the most painful realization was that Japanese courage had never truly been tested against American soldiers. It had been tested against American production, against factories that replaced tanks faster than Japan could destroy them, against shipyards that launched warships faster than Japan could sink them, against training systems that produced new units as old ones vanished. A general who survived the war admitted, "We prepared to fight men. We were not prepared to fight a nation." Even the atomic bombings, while shocking, were viewed by some Japanese generals as the final expression of a pattern they already understood. The weapon itself was horrifying, but the logic behind it was familiar. When faced with resistance, America applied overwhelming force to end the war as quickly as possible. One officer wrote bitterly, "The bomb was not a new idea. It was the same idea, perfected." In hindsight, Japanese generals recognized the fatal mistake made before the war began, believing that American society would not tolerate sacrifice. They misunderstood democracy as weakness and abundance as softness. They failed to grasp that once united, American industry could transform restraint into devastation. Many concluded that no strategy Japan could have adopted would have changed the outcome, only delayed it. Once American firepower reached full momentum, the war's end became inevitable. In the final reflections of several generals, there was no hatred, only regret. Regret for underestimating the enemy. Regret for believing courage could defeat machines. Regret for realizing the truth only after cities, armies, and an empire were gone. The story of what Japanese generals said about American firepower is not a story of arrogance alone. It is a warning, a reminder that in modern war, decisions made years earlier echo louder than any battlefield victory. And by the time those generals fully understood what American firepower truly meant, it was already too late. Period, underscore, period, underscore, period. Period, underscore, period, underscore, period, underscore, period, underscore period, underscore period, underscore period, underscore period, underscore period.